Very enlightening. There's plenty of time for questions, so please, any questions on the lecture or marginally related to the lecture? Anyone?
How do you think, going on what that last kind of question that you posed, how would you expect the Commission to respond to kind of the laws outside of the national governments that, let's say UK, introduced that £150 a week?
I would expect initially there to be statements made, and the Commission would certainly suggest to the UK government that it would be unlawful and a breach of EU law. Of course, the impact that would have on the government would be debatable. If the UK then press ahead, I would expect there to be the Commission to then bring proceedings before the court, and it would then progress in the legal sense. The Commission has done this before. We've had, there was a Commission Austria case, because following the 2004 round of enlargement, Austria sought to put in place restrictions, but some of the restrictions seem to go a little bit further than those envisaged in the transitional arrangements, and the Commission was quite happy to bring proceedings against Austria, and then the court sort of found in favour of the Commission, and Austria did eventually change its national rules, even though it required a little bit of political pressure to do so from the Commission following the case. So that can be a useful route for the Commission. The drawbacks of that is obviously quite timely. It takes a while for cases to get before the court. Well, that's the sort of process that I would expect.
Would an EU race at the bottom be inevitable with no regulation on wage and minimums?
So you mean with the absence of a uniform standard? I'm not sure if it would be inevitable, because if that was the case, we might have expected it to already have happened. And I guess a lot of it relates back to some of the things we talked about in Andrew's session earlier, in that there is still such diversity, and we can't really get away from that diversity. I think my worries about a race to the bottom would be not in relation to any sort of particular figures, but more to do with an undermining of the standards that have been developed in a legal sense. So a devaluing of that protection that the court has put in place, rather than concerns particularly about specific figures. So yeah, when I use the term race to the bottom, I think I was referring more generally to a race to undervalue that really now well-established legal protection. Where it becomes more difficult is if we have more of the older member states, so it's not just the UK, but if states like Germany or Austria or France, if it became more widespread as a general tendency to seek to put in place limitations on workers, that's where it becomes more difficult, because there's no guarantee that findings of illegality on the court part would actually have much effect, because obviously then it depends on the willingness of the member states to follow the court ruling at the end of the day. So I don't know really is the answer to your question. It's because this is quite a new situation. I'm not quite sure at the moment how it will play out.
And any more questions from your side? I was wondering, I mean, every single enlargement, perhaps not the 1995.
I think
Even then?
yeah, well, particularly with the 80s. With,
Yeah, 81, 86,
yeah.
with the enlargement towards Greece and then Spain and Portugal. Are these provisions that the governments are now considering, were they considered back then? Are they drawing on legal measures that were already implemented in the 80s? Are they reintroducing them? Is this a repetition of history?
Yeah, it is. I think that's a really interesting thing to our because transitional measures were implemented for Greece, Spain and Portugal, when they're needed. And so far the research across all of the different rounds of enlargement hasn't actually supported the requirement for visa restrictions that actually be imposed. So what the research tends to show is that actually after enlargement, what we tend to see is a lot of return migration. So we saw return migration to Ireland, we saw return migration to Spain to some extent.
So from the 2004 enlargement, what happened was Eastern European workers going to Spain and then going back?
Even migrants that had already left prior to enlargement actually go back home.
Yes.
And that's been that's been a repetitive finding in the research across the different rounds of enlargement. More recently, what we've seen in the UK is the UK did experience quite a lot of migration from Poland after 2004, but the data now tends to show that people are returning now. So I don't think I've answered your question very well. But transitional arrangements, they didn't just appear in 2004, they had been implemented before. But the research doesn't really bear on the economic need for them. And it does tend to show that there's a lot of return migration that happens after.
Okay. So, freedom of movement of workers, this was, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not a legal expert, but it was already enshrined in the first Treaty of Rome. And as you can see, it's been sort of contested throughout, and it's still, until today, being, for a while, you might have seen, after Maastricht with EU citizenship, and everybody, we're going to be EU citizens, all friends, there was going to be no problems, and Schengen had been agreed as well. At that time, it seemed like everything was going to work perfectly. But then these last two enlargements, they've cast some doubts on how committed some member states are to these principles. And this is a very fundamental principle for the Union.
Could that be because the new Eastern European states particularly had lower levels of development and higher levels of unemployment than the states previously, and the fears of those unemployed looking for work elsewhere that hadn't existed before?
Absolutely. And that's definitely what happened with the Southern enlargement, with the Mediterranean enlargement, when Greece, Spain and Portugal entered. And they were fairly low levels, 70% of the average of the other countries. The thing is, I think we've increased the gap. When Romania and Bulgaria entered, I don't know if they were even 40%, around 40% GDP. These are rough figures, GDP isn't everything, but definitely you saw Samantha had the minimum wage. I mean, most European countries would have, the old member states would have minimum wages around above 800 euros. And 67, I think I saw, and I don't know what the other figure was, monthly wages. You can see why anybody, why not go to, the fear is understandable in politicians. A different question is that I think the personal feeling of Romanian and Bulgarians, they might not think much of going all the way to England just to be, depending on social payments. I don't know, I guess that's holding the heads of the politicians to an extent. Of course, Bruno.
What's your observation of the Romania-Bulgaria 2000 January 2014, which I actually thought was January 2014, it doesn't. Because what brought the issue of migration versus labour movement very clearly to the fore was the issue of the gypsies and Roma communities, and where you had France, Italy, and Germany actually deporting these citizens. And on the 1st of January, I thought it was 2013, they had already put in place measures in order to deal with the fact that there would be free movement. So I suppose I've got two questions. One is the difference between the labour and the migration scenario. And the second was that Romania and Bulgaria had that pretty nasty provision that would be, sort of keeping the so-called floodgates under control. But that was kind of blown up in the water by the gypsy issue. And secondly, I'd urge a little bit of caution on the economic comparisons.
Mm-hmm.
When you are in Eastern Europe, you get a lot of things covered by the state. So I always think that when you make those comparisons, always an element of care.
Sure.
Childcare is free, you don't have to pay for it, and while it might be rubbish or crap, but it's there. So I think we do a bit of a disservice in giving some kind of this when it's probably more like that. And that could easily be applied even to the reunification of Germany with East versus West, where that was very much an issue that from the cradle to the grave was often covered by parts of the state. But I think in the West there's this tendency to kind of be very dismissive of this, and sooner or later we'll sort that out.
Thank you. Thanks for your comments. Okay, on that issue of the distinction between the labour issue and the migration issue. To just clarify, the 2014 date applied to the expiry of the transitional restrictions, that's the 7-year end from 2007 to 2014. Now, because a lot of what I've done is focusing on labour migration, the transitional arrangements that I've sort of analysed only apply to labour migration. So that broader movement outside the realms of labour, I haven't really analysed. But you're absolutely right to sort of draw that distinction, because there is this issue between migration for the purposes of work, which tends to be tied up with the UK debates as regards to benefits and employment levels. On the other hand, there's the migration issue in general, as you mentioned, particularly to do with Roma and Gypsies, which tends to be more important rates in the sort of southern European states. So what I didn't mean to do was to conflate the two. I did mean to focus on that issue of the labour migration. What is particularly distressing, of course, is the representation of Romanian and Bulgarian migrants and the Roma and Gypsy issue, which are by no means unexpected. So I don't think that answers your question, but I hope it explains how the two have been sort of conflated together in the presentation when they perhaps shouldn't have.
Mine was just a curiosity on the dates and the way the member states responded on that, which is what provoked Vivian Reddy to make a very controversial comparison to somebody in the Second World War, referring to Sarkozy. So that was a very provocative statement.
What did she say about Sarkozy?
That he was the guy who had a little, moustache under his nose. And of course Sarkozy was not, happy with that comparison, but it shows you that if a commissioner of the European Commission feels prompted to make that comparison, and they think about those things 10 times before they say it, it obviously got to report it. France was deporting the Roma Gypsies.
So this happened under the presidency of Nicolas Sarkozy in France. They were even deporting, I heard the claim, they were deporting their own nationals, moving them around because they couldn't really tell whether, for those of you that may not be aware of this, there is a huge, it's often been called the largest minority in Europe, Gypsy, Roma, Sinti, different names, each of them have different, I guess Roma is the most accepted one, I'm not sure. They're a population originally from India, and they inhabit many countries in Europe, from Ireland, where they're sometimes called travellers. I believe it's a similar name in the UK. There's many in Spain, quite a lot in Eastern European countries, some in France as well. And so because there are many issues with this, but let's say they're quite nomadic and they move around within countries, mainly in Central Europe, but also in Spain. I grew up seeing them organize all the fairs and so on. These people have been especially feared in this whole migration context because they've often been seen throughout the European continent as second-class citizens, if citizens at all. So in this particular case that Bruno was mentioning, the French state, headed by Mr. Sarkozy, was denounced by the Commission of Reading for basically deporting Romanian citizens of Gypsy ethnicity or Roma ethnicity, and also their own citizens that they didn't even know if they were actually Gypsy, Roma, French or not French. So you can see that there was a huge case of discrimination against what were actually, in that case, all EU citizens, and in some cases even French citizens. Yes, Laura?
I was just wondering how that would work in terms of the legal status of Romas, because, I mean, as far as I know, it's actually a misnomer because people thought a lot of them were originally from Romania, but a lot of them tended to be from some of the Western European countries as well. And because of the nomadic nature of their lifestyle, I know they have issues with their legal status of like nationality and stuff. So how would that work in terms of them being EU citizens, them not being citizens?
With the nomadic nature, so this is a people that I believe has been quite proven that they come from northern India. So, and the name of Roma has little to do with Romania, completely different issues. But I'll let Samantha talk about citizenship issues and so on. But as far as I know, the nomadic nature is quite limited. It's not like the Spanish gypsies go all the time back and forth to France. But it was feared that, you know, the gypsies in Romania were going to do that once they could. Now, I don't know exactly what the status is, but...
In terms of EU citizenship, so as if they were as nationals of an EU member state, they would be EU citizens. In order for them to benefit from any EU rights, there would have to be that element of cross-border movement. So, as Alfonso says, the nomadic nature does tend to be internally within the member state. From a legal point of view, once movement has sort of taken place across the border, that would activate some of the law on free movement. But in order to actually benefit from it, there would have to be certain thresholds that would have to be met. So in terms of EU citizenship generally, and there's a right to general free movement, that is conditional upon those who exercise it having a sufficient degree of resources and being covered by health insurance. So it still tends to be the citizenship right to free movement still tends to be most beneficial for those that already have a degree of security. So it would be sort of students who are involved in the EU, or those who seek to exercise a right to free movement once they've retired. So pension movement from the UK to Spain. So the general right to free movement will be difficult for them to access without having that degree of resources to rely on. Then, of course, in terms of what I've been talking about today, free movement of workers, they would have to qualify under that working definition in Article 45. So even though the court has been generous, like I said, in cease to encompass, it would still rely on them reaching a certain threshold in terms of carrying out work tend to, like Alfonso said, because I experienced this as well when I was a child, they would set up fairs and things or, that would operate for a short while and then close down, rather than say accessing a job in a host member state. So from that point of view, it would be difficult for travellers in that sense to benefit legally